Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining this webinar on Indigenous and local knowledge in the IPBES assessments of sustainable use of wild species and values of nature, which is organized by the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, the Centers of Distinction on Indigenous and Local Knowledge, the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network, and IPBES. So we're very happy to have you here today. My name is Peter Bates. I work in the IPBES Technical Support Unit on Indigenous and Local Knowledge, and I'll be taking us through the meeting today. So first of all, we just wanted to flag that we do have interpretation into English, French, and Spanish. Hopefully you all know how to do this. There's a globe symbol at the bottom of your screen with interpretation written. And if you go there, you can select either English, French, or Spanish. And even if you're an English speaker, please do go select the English channel, as we will have some people speaking in Spanish today. If you have any problems with that, please do just write in the chat. And then some very brief rules of engagement. Please self-mute when not making an intervention to reduce background noise. We're asking people to be fairly brief in their interventions so that everybody has a chance to speak. If you want to pose a comment or question, particularly if you're an attendee, you can write in the chat function or in the question and answer function. And again, if you're having any problems with that, you could just write in the chat because most people know how to use the chat, and we'll be able to help you sort that out. We will be recording the meeting with the aim of this being a publicly available resource. So if you do take the floor, and if afterwards you think, oh, actually, I'd rather that wasn't part of the public record, you can just contact us and we can cut your intervention out of the video that will finally be online. Okay, and so now with those background things cleared up and out of the way, it's my pleasure to pass over to Tata Felix for our opening. Please, the floor is yours.
Muy buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to salute all of you. And I would like to know if the camera is well focused on the altar. Yes, everything is fine. Yes, everything is fine. We can see the altar pretty well. So I would like to greet, and we are in the central plateau of Guatemala, in Quechiquén. With your permission, I will put you in the context of today. Today, in the Mayan calendar, today is Kawuk Day. Kawuk is the energy that guides and that helps all the midwives. A lot of the girls that are being born today, many of them are going to born today, are going to be midwives. Therefore, if we analyze the work they do, all the knowledge that they gather, we have such a wide scientific knowledge and everything that is around that and around medicinal plants. That knowledge that they have of every plant from the nature, that energy of the plant is important, but also there is astronomical knowledge, basically from the moon, the position of the moon, that is very important for the work they perform. And we can analyze this day. This is a feminine day. This is a feminine energy. And if we see the sacred books of the Popol Vuh, today is the day of, there is a lot of practice. There is science, not only history, but also science on how this Mayan society was formed. And if we see an example of the moon in the Popol Vuh, it reminds us that all the energies of the universe and Mother Earth is double. We have masculine and feminine energy, and how in the Popol Vuh and in many of our practices, we have this complementarity that is really necessary, this unity that we have to keep the energies united of women within the development of our society, the development of science as well. And for example, to see the Ishkik, this is an important name. It is daughter of one of the infraworld persons. The infraworld is everything that is below the soil. And in the Popol Vuh, it is clear. She's the first genetist, the first person that manipulated the seeds. Chaiskiki is a woman. And for example, to see the moon phases, the moon, well, it's like a deity. Its name is Shukane. And for example, when it rains, now it's a rainy season, we are in the quarter. It is the period where we have the rain. And so this is like a goddess. It's like a grandmother moon. And we can have many examples of all that. And we can see that with all the knowledge, there are a lot of norms, there are a lot of things that need to be done in order to take care of the forest, all the nature. So the book says that all the mountains, everything is there. They have owners, and the owners are the animals that are the guardians of all the waters, of the rivers, of the lakes. They all have their custodians. But now the question is, who will take care of those custodians? Well, we have guardians of the guardians. We are human beings, but the problem is we have to ask if we are really doing our job of guarding the guardians. So this is what we are doing today, to ask our grandmothers to have this feminine energy, to ask all the grandmothers who are educators to guide our knowledge and to guide our path in the right way, to keep us teaching us all the things that are necessary for life and for conservation. So with the permission of the authorities, brothers and sisters, we are going to open a space here in order to honor our ancestors. Thank you, Creator, and the one who formed the universe and Mother Earth. Thank you. First, grandparents that were created. Thank you to the grandfather Pierre. Thank you to the guardian of this day, grandmother Hawok. Please accept our flowers, our fire as a payment, so that to allow us to have this meeting that we have today. We will have a lot of knowledge that you have given us, and today your children, the indigenous peoples here, still preserve and put into practice the way we take care, the way we do things with love. And when you have a flower or a petal of a flower that you put with love, and also talk about taking care of the forest, of the water, our respect, our love, it is important for our knowledge, because the first thing we have to do is to respect all the things that exist, all the things that are around us, because every element in life has life. Even a rock has life, essence. That's why we talk to them. We take care of them, not only trees or animals. we always have to show respect. So please accept our payment and please guide our meeting. We hope this meeting will reach their objectives, so each one of the participants, all the ones that made an effort to be here, will be happy, satisfied. So please allow our path to go on, to be able to move forward and to leave a good reminder for the happiness of everyone. Accept our word, accept this, all this, that it comes from the heart with a lot of faith that we are giving you. Thank you, grandparents, grandmothers, and grandfathers. With your permission, thank you. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you so much, Tata, for starting us off in such an important way. We really appreciate having that grounding in prayer and spirituality to start the meeting. I'd like to now give the floor to Ramiro Batson, who is co-chair of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, to give some opening words. Ramiro.
Gracias, muy buenos días, buenas tardes.
Thank you, good morning, good evening, good night. On behalf of my co-chair, Lucy Molenque, and myself, I would like to give you to welcome you to this webinar with the sustainable use and the values of the nature. On behalf of the organizers, International Forum on Biodiversity, and the Centers of Distinction on Traditional Knowledge and Local Knowledge, the Network of Indigenous Women for Biodiversity, and IPBES, it's an honor to welcome you to this important event. And I would like to tell you that Indigenous peoples, we have several values from nature. We have a close relationship with Mother Nature, and we have our traditional use of our biodiversity. Animals, plants are our nourishment, our medicines for spiritual means. And today we will have the honor to go know the results of the evaluations of IPBES on the value and sustainable use of species, mainly all the things that are related to indigenous peoples. The results are very important for the GBD, the biodiversity framework post to 2020, and we hope will be adopted in the 15th Conference of the Parties that will be held this year in December in Montreal. All the studies had the contribution of indigenous peoples and were important not only for indigenous peoples but also for all the population in general, because it is related to Mother Nature, to protection. And we hope also that the studies will be able to widen and to allow to understand how indigenous people live in equilibrium with Mother Nature, the human being, and the universe, as Tata Felix mentioned. I would like to thank all of you that contributed to this event, the technical unit from UNESCO and IPBES, and Ana Maria Hernandez, and co-chair of the evaluation of species, Marla, and all the ones that were working on the evaluation of the values, Marianne, Simone, Elena, all the members of indigenous peoples and local communities that contributed to this important event. I would like to tell you that what we will hear today is a very important event where we will be talking about traditional knowledge, biodiversity, something that we need, and we need to reinforce the world and have positive actions. Indigenous peoples and all the ones that called for this event are working on that, and we ask all of you to join. So welcome, thank you for your participation, and go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ramiro, for those words and for giving us a good context to get us started in this meeting. It's now my pleasure to pass over the floor to Ana Maria Hernandez, the chair of IPBES. Ana Maria.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, Ramiro, Tata, for this opening that is so important for us. This is the first meeting that we have after our plenary meeting that we held past July in Bonn in Germany. And well, first, of course, I want to welcome all of you to this webinar it was especially organized around the sustainable use of wild species and the multiple value of nature. We are very happy and very thankful from the heart toward today. Thanks to the coordination with the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, the International Indigenous Women's Network on Biodiversity, and the Centers of the Extinction and Indigenous and Local Knowledge. Now I'm going to turn to Spanish porque quiero desde mi lengua natal.
Because I would like, from my own language, I would like from the bottom of my heart to welcome all of you, but also to mention a couple of things that are important. The first is that it was great to see each other again in person during the plenary. As you know, the process of discussion for sustainable use and the biodiversity, you have been involved even before the approval of the assessments and during the discussions. I would like to mention a little sadness that I have, because during the plenary, you know that I didn't have the capacity to give you a better space for intervention, or we had some technical issues, and that's why I would like to apologize for that. And I hope this webinar will allow us to hear, well, at least part of the very valuable comments that were pending during our discussions in Bonn. And I hope that those little issues will be solved for our next plenary that will be in the US next April, in May. As we have said, in July, in the 9th plenary, we approved two very important evaluations that had your feedback, your big work and observations. Ramiro was mentioning it, and one of the sustainable use of wildlife. I would like to mention the presence of Marla and the experts that are here from that evaluation. And we approved an evaluation on the values about biodiversity. I know that David is there. There are experts of multiple values. I don't see all of them. So all the authors and technical units of support that have been working, I would like to thank you for your work. And in the middle of the lessons we are learning in this dialogue path, intercultural dialogue, I'm pretty sure that we will all work so that the space will be the starting point of a robust process to make sure that the knowledge that we have approved in the plenary not only will be useful to all of you, not only locally, but also in general for decision making, but to be sure and to be working openly with the confidence so that our processes from IPBES will be reflecting the diversity of knowledge, vision, experiences, and of life of all the communities and peoples. So I invite you to have a very gentle, open, and transparent discussion, as always. And this is the example that you have given from indigenous peoples and local communities. You have taught us this in a permanent way. So thank you, and a lot of success in this webinar that we have today.
And thank you so much, Ana Maria, also for those opening words. And now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to pass over to Viviana Figueroa, who is a member of the IPBES Task Force on Indigenous and Local Knowledge, and also a member of the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network. And she'll be taking us through the next steps of this webinar. So, Viviana, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Peter. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, and thank you all participants to give me this great honor. Aims of this meeting are to introduce the findings of the two different assessments. Specifically, we're going to be reflecting on how these findings say about indigenous people and local communities and how this is closely related, or why is it so important for policymakers. This is a process of ensuring that IPLCs benefit from his work on the values and sustainable use in biodiversity. We have this great aim that in 2 hours, you'll get to know the most important findings of these assessments related to indigenous peoples and local communities. Next one, please. Thanks. This is the agenda for today. Well, the opening, the welcome remarks, the spiritual ceremony led by Tata Feliz from the Maya people. We will then move on to the presentation on sustainable use of wild species. We'll have a space for discussions, Q&A, and later on we will move to the presentation of values, where we'll have an open discussion where you can share your questions, and then the closing. Next one, please. It is important to review the background we're using, specifically what is IPBES. Next one, please. Great. Well, IPBES stands for the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It is an independent intergovernmental body established by member states, as you can read, in 2012, with 139 member countries. I do have an issue myself. Apologies, please. Just a second. But okay, I think I got it. The overall objective is to work on assessments and to strengthen the science policy interface, the public policies. At the long run, it also aims at the use of these assessments could be important for conservation and sustainable use. Next one, please. And I think you skip one. Can you just go back, please? Oh, no. Oh, 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 well. So far, we have gone through several assessments. It is important that IPBES do acknowledge traditional knowledge and different traditional views are included and are taken into account in the different completed assessment. Pollinators, pollination and food production was one. 4 regional assessment took place. We also have a land degradation and restoration assessment and the global assessment. Next one. As I mentioned before, IPBES recognizes the importance of indigenous and local knowledge to the conservation and sustainable use of ecosystems. IPBES works hard on local and indigenous knowledge and within their deliverables and objectives. There's a specific task force where I belong to, and they even have a technical support unit that is based on UNESCO. IPBES has this approach to recognizing and working with ILQ, which was approved by the member states in 2017. And it also follows a specific methodological guidance in order to create this open dialogue among different knowledge. Next slide, please. Both assessments follow the IPBES approach and includes the indigenous and local knowledge, and we have even seen the inclusion of authors, experts, authors, in holders and experts. They were even dialogue workshops that were organized and that include the whole process of sharing knowledge and reviewing and validating results. We had also held online calls for contributions and several reviews of literal materials. Indigenous people were able to send authors the different reports, videos, input, or even work arts. So it was a quite rich exchange. Next slide, please. And we will, of course, acknowledge all those who participated or who have contributed to, of course, the dialogue workshop participants, to several groups and individuals who send materials, and those who have reviewed those and share comments. These are several photos. You see that there were meetings that were held online, dialogues that were held online, and this has been a very important exchange. There were open discussions, sincere discussions and dialogues, as Ana Maria mentioned in her remarks. Next one, please. Oh, and of course, without the contribution of all of you and the openness, this has helped to reflect indigenous people voices to be heard within the assessment. Next one, please. Well, results. On the results, you can see the different chapters, but also a summary for policymakers, which was approved in the last plenary session. Those reports are available online in the IPBES website, and we will be also sharing them via this chat. The links in the report are a little bit longer, but the summary for policymakers actually highlight the key findings, and those are the ones that we reviewed in the plenary, and those will be the documents to be used by countries to take into consideration those views in the national level. Next one, please. Thank you once again. Hopefully, when we will be listening to the assessment results, we can have the space to discuss openly and friendly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Viviana, for providing that background and context to IPBES overall. And it shows the overall process in which these two important assessments were developed and the work that was done with Indigenous peoples and local communities, and also how member states also participated. And that's what I think one of the things we want to emphasize is that because it's been through this process with member states as well, the idea is that the results are particularly taken seriously by policymakers themselves. Before we turn over to the sustainable use of wild species assessment, I just wanted to check. It seems like a few people are having problems with the interpretation. So I'm just going the wrong way. I'm just going to go back to the interpretation slide to make sure that everybody understands how the interpretation works. So there's a globe icon at the bottom of the screen, and you can select that, and then options should come up for English, French, or Spanish, and you should be able to select one of those. It seems like some people are in the channels and they're not hearing anything, but then other people are hearing the interpretation okay. So it may be that there's problems with individual connectivity rather than the overall system. So we'll keep trying to fix that. And apologies if you are having difficulties. And please do let us know in the chat if you are. Okay, and now it is my pleasure to pass the floor over to Marla Emery, who is one of the co-chairs of the Sustainable Use Assessment, and she'll be introducing the assessment to us and explaining the key findings. Marla, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Peter. Pues saludos a todos y es un placer estar aquí con ustedes.
It is a pleasure to be with all of you. It is a great pleasure to fund with you.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all.
It is a pleasure
thank you so much for attending
your time
this
and
webinar today, for your
on
attention.
Into English.
But I want to say thank you to Tata Felix, to Ramiro, to Ana Maria, and to Viviana for getting us off to such a good and important start today. It's my pleasure to present to you the results of the assessment report on the sustainable use of wild species, which I have the honor to co-chair, and the special honor to chair the Indigenous and local knowledge component of. May we have the next slide, please? So as specified in the scoping document, the objectives of the sustainable use assessment were to analyze the status and trends in the current sustainable use of wild species and drivers and causes of those changes, to consider approaches that could enhance the sustainable use of wild species, and to identify challenges and opportunities for doing that. And importantly, to strengthen existing practices, measures, capacities, and tools that are leading to sustainable use of wild species, and all while recognizing the inseparable unity of nature and humanity. Next slide, please. So we began this work in 2018 when none of us imagined that we would complete it during a pandemic. We had three co-chairs, myself, Jean-Marc Fromentin, who is a marine biologist from France, and John Donaldson, who is a terrestrial ecologist from South Africa. We had the amazing participation of 75 experts from 35 different countries, and we were very pleased that the assessment was approved by the member states in July of this year. Next slide, please. The assessment is divided into 6 chapters, which you see listed here. It is north of 2,000 pages long, but thankfully, there is a summary for policymakers, which is approximately 25 pages, which is backed up by all of that material in the 6 chapters. Next slide, please. So I'd like to walk you through that summary for policymakers, the key messages in it, and some background, especially that came to be in this assessment through the generous participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities in our 3 workshops and through the call for contributions. Next slide, please. So the summary for policymakers is all about the key messages for policy that arise out of those 2,000 plus pages, with some brief background information to describe and support each of those key messages. We have divided our summary for policymakers into 4 sections. The first clearly lays out why sustainable use of wild species is critical for both people and nature. The second provides an overview of the status and trends in the uses of wild species. The third identifies the key elements and conditions that lead to sustainable use. And the fourth identifies pathways and levers that will promote sustainable use going forward in what we know will be a very changeable future. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at that first section of the assessment on why sustainable use of wild species is critical for people and nature. Next slide, please. First, we note that billions of people in all regions of the world rely on and benefit from the use of wild species for food, for medicine, for energy, for income, and for many other purposes. Secondly, and especially important, I think perhaps in this context, we note that sustainable use of wild species is central to the identity and the existence of many Indigenous peoples and local communities. And finally, in that section, it is clear that ensuring sustainability of the use of wild species is critical to reverse the global trend in biodiversity decline. So let's take each one of those key messages in turn, but in particular, the second of them. Next slide, please. So we note, based on the literature, but most importantly, again, on the invaluable input from participants in our Indigenous and local knowledge workshops, that wild species play essential roles in the well-being of many Indigenous peoples and local communities. And loss of opportunity to engage in sustainable use represents literally an existential threat to those peoples. And we take the opportunity to signal the special importance of cultural keystone species. The photograph that you see here is members of Anishinabe Tribe, often in English referred to as Ojibwa, harvesting wild rice, which is a staple food and has been for millennia, a staple food of the Indigenous peoples in this region, is often a component of ceremonies and rituals, and is so central to the identity of Anishinaabe peoples that it is a source of it. Their names are based on it in multiple cases, and place names are based on it. May I have the next slide, please? We further note that sustainable use contributes to the livelihoods of IPLCs through subsistence, that is direct use without mitigation by markets, but also through trade in both informal and formal markets. So sustainable uses of wild species provides direct sources of food, medicine, fuel, and other livelihood resources. And this is true in developed and developing countries. And that is a very important point throughout the sustainable use assessment, that this is important in both developed and developing countries. Wild foods are often nutritionally superior to cultivated species or other substitutes that might be available in markets. And frequently there is no culturally acceptable alternative for a wild species in ceremonies and rituals. Uses of wild species are the basis for culturally meaningful employment. And we also found it important to note that trade, long distance trade by Indigenous peoples and local communities has been going on for millennia and continues to be important. Next slide, please. We note that the knowledge, practices, and worldviews, including spirituality, guide sustainable use of wild species by many IPLCs. And while there are thousands of Indigenous cultures and local cultures around the world, there are some common values or principles that are applied to uses of wild species and that ensure their sustainability for the present generation and many generations into the future. And those include engaging in uses of wild species with respect, observing the principle of reciprocity. If you take something, you give something. Avoiding waste in what is taken, managing harvests carefully, and ensuring fair and equitable distribution. And these principles are frequently upheld by community institutions and governance structures. And I know that I am not telling this group anything that you don't know. It's simply here to let you know how we have presented this and our hopes for it going into the world and making a difference. So we've tried to capture all of that in this figure, which is figure 3 in the summary for policymakers. And in it, you see around the outside that knowledge, community, identity, and spirituality are all the context within which sustainable use of wild species by Indigenous peoples and local communities takes place. And it depends on and provides all of these factors that are in the green circle just below, just inside the outside. And again, you see in the middle, the centrality of those concepts of respect, reciprocity, and responsibility, as well as the existence of abundant and healthy wild species for sustainable use of wild species by Indigenous peoples and local communities and humanity at large. Next slide, please. So in the third key message, we likewise have a supporting point that is specific to Indigenous peoples and local communities. And that is to note that everything that we've said in A2 it is not theoretical. It can be seen on the ground. Indigenous peoples manage fishing, gathering, and terrestrial animal harvesting and other uses of wild species on more than 38 square kilometers of land in 87 countries. And these tend to coincide with about 40% of terrestrial conserved areas, many of which have high biodiversity, and that is not a coincidence. And further, deforestation is generally lower on Indigenous territories. And we note that sustainable use can increase biodiversity while supporting well-being and livelihoods, as can be seen in the 15% of global forests that are managed as community resources by Indigenous peoples and local communities. Next slide, please. So in section B, we look at the status and trends in the use of wild species. Next slide, please. We note that the status and trends in uses of wild species vary depending upon the type of use, the scale of use, and the social and ecological contexts of those uses. And that the sustainability of the use of wild species can be influenced negatively or positively by many different drivers. Finally, that key elements of sustainable use have been identified, and there are relevant international and regional standards, agreements, and certification schemes, but there is a shortage of indicators to monitor the sustainability of uses of wild species, and in particular, our shortage of indicators with regard to the social components. May I have the next slide, please? So here, we specifically note that there are multiple drivers that threaten Indigenous peoples and local communities' ability to maintain and to restore sustainable uses within their communities and their territories. And among those are national and sectoral policies that do not support the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities to access lands, territories, and to engage in customary sustainable uses. But again, we have a lack of data and indicators to monitor progress in this regard. Next slide, please. Other negative factors in this regard include loss of Indigenous and local languages, education programs that are disconnected from local cultural and environmental conditions, a lack of attention to the kinds of gendered roles that Tata Felix brought to our minds as we began this webinar. And frequently mentioned was integration into monetized and commodified economic systems that devalue Indigenous and local knowledge and practices. Next slide, please. Secure rights over land and resource use and trade clearly can incentivize resource conservation, sustainable use, and diverse livelihoods. And this, among other reasons, is because it gives more opportunities for effective regulation of use patterns and allows for longer-term planning and governance. We also note, however, that illegal seizures of land violate the rights of Indigenous peoples and diminish food security and tend to lead to much degraded conservation outcomes. Next slide, please. We note that education, communication, and public awareness are key drivers of sustainable use, either for the good or for the bad, but they are seldom prioritized as policy options. Education, communication, and public awareness campaigns are more effective when they promote time outside in nature, when they respect the cultures and languages of Indigenous peoples and local communities, when they include women and girls, elders and youth, and when they promote intra and intergenerational transmission of knowledge. And we recognize that embedding Indigenous and local knowledge into education systems supports sustainable use. Next slide, please. So in the next two sections, you will note that there are some common themes that came out loud and clear. So let's take a look at the third section on key elements and conditions for sustainable use of wild species. Next slide, please. We find that policy instruments and tools are most successful when they're tailored to the social and ecological context in which they will be applied, and when they support fairness, rights, and equity. Policy instruments and tools are more effective when they're supported by robust and adaptive, that adaptive is very important, institutions, and are aligned across sectors and scales. It is also important that there be inclusive participatory mechanisms to enhance the adaptive capacity of policy instruments. Finally, effective monitoring of social, economic, and ecological outcomes supports better decision-making. And while scientific evidence is often limited, Indigenous and local knowledge is frequently present, but underutilized and undervalued. Next slide, please. So diving a little deeper into the first of those points, We note that conceptualizations of sustainable use influence policymaking. How we think about it influences what we do. Surprise. However, cultural contexts receive very little attention in this regard. And this in particular leads to a lack of recognition of practices of Indigenous peoples and local communities and support for their tenure and access rights. Next slide, please. We note further that fairness, rights, and equitable distribution of benefits are essential to ensure long-term sustainable use. It's important to make sure that small producers don't lose out through measures that are drafted primarily to promote the interests of the powerful and the advantaged. And in contrast to positively influence sustainable use, secure rights of access and use, social capital, participation in governance, and accountability play important positive roles. And we note that while certification is often advanced as a strategy for accomplishing this, it is also frequently beyond the reach of small-scale producers, including Indigenous peoples and local communities. And we provide here a box that is an example of the important case of vicuña, which has had tremendous success in the conservation of vicuña, but there is room perhaps to travel yet in terms of the distribution of benefits. Next slide, please. So robust governance systems tend to include participatory mechanisms that integrate customary and statutory laws, include participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the policy design phase, recognize gender in their construction and gender differences and roles, and include monitoring. Next slide, please. We recognize that strengthening customary institutions and rules often makes an important contribution to sustainable use of wild species. Doing this can reduce conflicts and increase policy effectiveness. It can lower the costs for monitoring and enforcement, and support the social, ecological, and economic dimensions of sustainability. But unfortunately, cultural systems are seldom incorporated into policy. Next slide, please. So returning to monitoring and noting that it is important to monitor the ecological, the social, and the economic aspects for sustainable use of wild species. We note that many Indigenous peoples and local communities have well-developed strategies for monitoring uses of wild species. For example, in the Canadian Arctic, the amount of caribou back fat or the changing flavor of fish provides important information about the health of those populations. And knowledge can be passed from generation to generation in timeframes that are much longer than scientific studies, and that is very important. And happily, there are increasingly robust networks of Indigenous peoples and local communities dedicated to monitoring. Next slide, please. So policy instruments and tools are more effective when they include plural knowledge systems. And so we highlight that bringing together scientists and holders of Indigenous and local knowledge to co-produce knowledge improves decision-making. An inclusion of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the development and implementation of policies requires sustained commitment, however. It's not a one-shot deal. It is, and recognition of both systems as authoritative. Of course, however, there must be free, prior, and informed consent. And importantly, protocols on access and benefit sharing must be observed. Next slide, please. So section D, we look at the pathways and the levers that promote sustainable use in a changing future. Next slide, please. So Sustainable use in the future is likely to be challenged by a number of factors, but particularly climate change, the increasing demand for goods, products, and wild species, and technological advances that make for more, shall we say, efficient or intensive harvesting. And addressing these challenges is going to require transformative changes. So concerted interventions will be needed to implement and scale up policy actions that have proven to be effective. We note that the world is dynamic and therefore sustainable use requires constant negotiation and adaptive management, a common vision of what sustainable use is, and transformative change in the human-nature relationship. And let me go back to that common vision of sustainable use while recognizing great diversity in values and cultures. Next slide, please. So we identify 7 key elements or sets of policy actions that could be levers of change. And you will have heard these before, but here we put them in a clear and succinct order. And these are inclusive and participatory decision-making, inclusion of multiple forms of knowledge and recognition of rights, equitable distribution of costs and benefits, policies tailored to local social and ecological contexts, monitoring, and that is monitoring of both the social and the ecological aspects of wild species uses, coordinated and aligned policies, and robust institutions from customary to statutory institutions. Next slide, please. So we note, and this comes very importantly out of the IPLC workshops, that sustainable use will benefit from a transformative change in the prevailing or the dominant conceptualization of nature. Considering humanity to be part of nature would lay the foundation for a more respectful and sustainable relationship, as is shown by Indigenous peoples and local communities' traditional practices and uses. Next slide, please. So we've noted a number of knowledge gaps with respect to Indigenous and local knowledge of sustainability in the use of wild species. These include methods for co-developing such approaches with IPLCs and weaving together science and Indigenous and local knowledge. Documentation of Indigenous and local knowledge regarding sustainable use, again, always observing the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. Monitoring processes and indicators co-produced with Indigenous peoples and local communities. Developing scenarios that are co-produced with Indigenous peoples and local communities that will allow us to anticipate the future of uses of wild species and consider how to make them more sustainable. Approaches to support and revitalize Indigenous and local knowledge and customary governance. And capacity building and support for Indigenous peoples and local communities to conduct research, monitoring, and governance. And next slide, which I believe that's the last one. Yeah, so thank you all so very much for your attention. We look forward to your questions and your comments. Gracias a todos y anticipo con mucha...
Thank you, and we're happy to hear your comments and questions.
Thank you, everyone, and we wait and expect your comments and observations. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marla, for providing that fascinating overview of the summary for policymakers of the assessment on the sustainable use of wild species. So now we are going to have a question and answer and discussion session. As always, we're running a little bit behind time. We have a group of assessment authors sitting with us behind the scenes here. So we have Marla from USA, Ram Chowdhury from Nepal, Marie-Christine from France, Shalini from India, Gabriela from Argentina, and Patricia from the United States. So they're all here to answer your questions. So please do feel free, preferably to write your questions in the question and answer function. Or you can write them in the chat, and we'll be keeping an eye on them as they come in, and we'll be starting to respond to those. So please do use those two functions to start proposing your questions. And while you're doing that, and we may also give the floor to a few people from the attendees who want to take the floor. So to get us started, we have people who volunteered in advance to give us some reflections. Unfortunately, Onel isn't able to join us today. So first, I'll give the floor to Ruth Spencer from Antigua and Barbuda to provide her reflections on what we've just heard. So Ruth, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to see the numbers that are following the processes. My reflections having been participating in the various assessments, I found them to be very inclusive and participatory, also very open and transparent, and we had opportunities in the workshop sessions to ask questions, get clarity. But more important, there was timely access of information. The information was always sent to us well in advance so that we could study them, discuss them at the local level, provide any inputs or observations that was needed. In addition, the workshops followed the FPIC processes. Nothing was done without our consent. When the reports were prepared, the assessment, the workshop reports were prepared, we were always told to review. Nothing is final until, we basically signed off. And these principles, reminded me of certain articles in the Escazú Agreement, access to information, participatory processes. And what's very important, the assessments are part of a holistic process. What I mean by that, synergies can be built with the other conventions. We look at things, the vision for biodiversity, living in harmony with nature, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And there are so many synergies that can be built when the local voices are heard and part of the decision-making processes. In addition, I think going forward, we see human rights-based approaches being used. And the work being done by IPLCs, as you know, we put our lives on the table. Protection of the environmental stewards, the environmental defenders. The vision for biodiversity is what guides our work, and we are willing to pay the consequences to protect our culture, our history, and our knowledge. So I commend IPBES and the authors for the inclusive spaces that were provided to us. And I hope going forward, this will continue to be followed, enhanced, and that we will be able to always share our knowledge in the IPBES processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for getting us started with those important reflections about the process and also the importance of the assessments for Indigenous peoples and also, crucially, local communities as well. So we're getting different questions here coming through on the question and answer. I'd like to pose them to some of the authors, probably particularly Marla, if possible. So if Marla can be ready to come on line. One of the questions we had, which I'd like to pose, is from Donald Rojas. And he's saying he didn't clearly see the negative impacts of state conservation policies that limit the use and management of indigenous peoples. So was there reflection in the assessment on the negative impacts of state conservation policies? Marla, if you could give us some thoughts on that.
Yes, yes, there were. We note that state policies of a variety of types can adversely impact sustainable use of wild species, and those can include infrastructure, energy, protected areas, so yes, we do note that.
Excellent. Thank you, Marla. And another question. I've lost the question now, but what did we mean by scenarios co-developed by Indigenous peoples and local communities?
So when scenarios are developed, and I should perhaps turn this over to Maria Gasaya, to Mary Gasaya, who led Chapter 5, our chapter on scenarios, but I will just preface before turning over to Mary that when scenarios are developed, frequently they are developed in conversation with, in participation with local communities, and those can as easily be Indigenous communities as well. So may I turn it over to you, Mary?
I'll just give her a moment. Hopefully she can speak. Okay, perhaps unfortunately she's not able to sign in to the speaking function. We had another few questions as well. There's a question here from Ronald Orenstein. My greatest concern is that actions taken ostensibly to promote sustainable use, for example, deregulation, may inadvertently create loopholes for unsustainable exploitation by industrial users, wildlife crime syndicates, and so on. What is it best doing to ensure that its conclusions are not being misused in this way?
That's an excellent question. So we took a great deal of pain, shall we say, to note the effects of organized crime and illegal harvests of wild species, and the importance of addressing that straight on, of monitoring and of developing policies and enforcement strategies to address and eliminate, or at least reduce, if one cannot eliminate, the unsustainable use of that. We also note that one of the ongoing challenges to sustainable use of wild species is industrial scale harvest and trade in them. And that goes hand in hand, unfortunately, in many cases, with the participation of organized crime, of political entities that are using illegal trade in wild species as sources of income. And so that is, yes, that is addressed head on in the assessment.
Great. Thank you so much, Marla. We'll just do a few more questions live, and then we'll be moving over to the values assessment. We have a comment here from Faisal Mulla talking about, I won't read it all, but noting that often governments and conservation are focusing on endangered species rather than looking at culturally significant species that may not be at risk at national and global scales, but which are vulnerable at local scales. And it'd be interesting if you have any thoughts on that, perhaps from your work in the United States, if there are any movements towards looking at culturally significant species.
Well, I can address that question in particular with regards to the United States, where I've had the great pleasure of working while I was a research scientist with the United States Forest Service with Anishinabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wabanaki tribes on precisely that question. So that case study on wild rice comes out of some of that work. Wild rice, as I said, is a cultural keystone species in that region. And I'm happy to say that there is an excellent partnership between the United States and the Anishinaabe, or many Ojibwa tribes, to work on sustainability of wild rice. And I've been working personally for the last 25 years with the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, on what we were going to do about the fact that another cultural keystone species, black ash, Fraxinus nigra, is being decimated by an invasive alien species, and the implications of that for cultural survival. And there are many other examples in the US that I know of, because I've worked on them. And I'd be happy to share those if one wants to get in touch with me after this. And I know that those are only the examples I'm aware of, that there are many examples around the world. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marla. So I think now we'll turn over to the assessment on values of nature. So please do keep asking questions in the question and answer. You'll see that our team of authors from the assessment are responding to those questions. And once they've been answered, you should all be able to see them. So we will aim to get to all of your questions before the end of the session. And if you do have any outstanding questions that you feel we weren't able to address, you can always send an email to me. I'll put my email address in the chat at the end, and you can send me an email, and I can contact the authors, and we can follow up with anything you feel like you weren't able to ask due to the short length of time. So thank you all so much for that. Thank you, Marla, and thank you to all of the authors who were participating behind the scenes, and also thank you, Ruth, for providing your reflections. And with that, it is my pleasure to pass over to, I believe it's Mariana Cantu, who will take us through the opening sections of the assessment report on the diverse values and valuation of nature. Please.
Yes, thank you so much, Peter. And also I want to take a few moments just to thank the organizers for opening this space for us to connect and to exchange some ideas regarding the diverse values and valuation of nature report. And also, of course, thank you to all the attendees for your interest and your time in this assessment. My name is Mariana Cantu. I am part of the technical support unit for the values assessment. And along with Simone Ataigi, Tujeni Mompamba, and Elena Lazos, we will be presenting to you today a few of the highlights of this report. Next. So we will begin the presentation by introducing the values assessment and how it was prepared. And then we will look at some of the key findings that are presented in the summary for policymakers. Next. And next, thanks. So the IPBES values assessment is a methodological assessment, and as such, it attends or intends to provide guidance and options by explaining these questions throughout their 6 chapters. So the first one is, how have values of nature been considered previously, and why is this assessment needed? Then chapter 2 takes the question how to make sense of the multiple ways in which people understand, relate, and value nature. Also, chapter 3 takes on how to make visible the diverse values of nature through valuation methods and tools, and how to choose the most appropriate for each context. Next. Chapter 4 continues by answering the question on how can values be considered in decision and policy making. Chapter 5 presents numerous pathways that can lead us into just and sustainable futures. And finally, Chapter 6 presents options on how to bridge knowledge gaps and develop key capacities for achieving these futures while tackling the current environmental crisis. Next. So as mentioned before, this assessment is confirmed by 6 chapters, which whose key findings are presented in the summary for policymakers that contains 10 key messages up front and is followed by background information organized in these 4 sections. Section A, understanding the diverse values of nature. B, measuring and making visible the values of nature. C, leveraging the diverse values of nature for transformative change towards sustainability. And finally, D, embedding the values of nature for transformative decision-making for sustainability. There are also 7 boxes throughout the summary for policymakers that present key definitions and also some concrete examples. Next. So this report was prepared by 95 experts and 200 contributing authors from all around the world, who were supported by a management committee from IPBES. But it is also important to mention that there were members of Indigenous and local communities, and also experts on Indigenous and local knowledge that participated throughout the 6 chapters. And if one person was to undertake this same effort, it would take about 19 years of uninterrupted work to prepare the same report that we have for you today. Next. So before moving to this next part on the key findings, there are 2 points that I would like to make. First is that the key findings that you are about to see are those that are of particular relevance to Indigenous peoples and local communities, or that are heavily or partially informed by Indigenous and local knowledge. This is to say that all of the other key messages are also relevant to all peoples and organizations, but this selection we think that could be of particular interest to this audience. And the second point that I want to make is that the way that the presentation is organized from here on does not necessarily follow the order of the key messages up front of the document, but rather follows the organization of the sections. So Simone will begin with section A on values of nature, followed by Tujeni with section B, which is about valuation methods and tools. And the presentation will be closed by Elena and Simone, regarding decision-making, values, and just and sustainable futures. So without further ado, I want to give the floor to Simone. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Mariana. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and see you well.
Thanks. Yes, good morning, everyone. I want to just take a minute to thank everyone for being here. Thank to all Indigenous peoples and local communities, organizations, and people that are joining us for this session. I also want to thank the TSU for the incredible work that David, Mariana, Peter, and others have done in both of these assessments. And I will start now the presentation on section A, which is directed to provide a deeper understanding of what are values of nature and the different conceptualizations of values of nature to support then how we can improve or develop valuation methods, and then towards improving also decision-making processes. So the next slide, please. So of course, one of the main findings of our assessment was that values are very diverse, but we need a common understanding, kind of be on the same level, same page of conceptualization and defining what are values. So Values we define as that reflect life goals, beliefs, and general guiding principles that people have towards each other, towards the world around us. And the main finding, like I said, one of the main findings is that values are very diverse and vary greatly across worldviews, knowledge systems, and languages. And this diversity has important implications for evaluation and decision-making. Next one. So of course, as you know, the IPBES processes, there is like a very thorough review of the literature, but also different sources of evidence that were provided, including by Indigenous peoples and local communities, and through the dialogues and workshops that were held with Indigenous peoples and local communities. And through the review also of policy documents, we found that most policymaking approaches have prioritized a rather narrow set of values of nature, often ignoring values associated to Indigenous peoples and local communities' worldviews. And so market-based, which are reflecting instrumental values or values linked to biodiversity for its own sake that are promoted by conservation policies, have been mostly prioritized in policymaking, whereas other types of values, such as relational values that are held by many Indigenous peoples and local communities, but not only, many segments of society and other groups also held diverse relational values with nature, have not been so predominant or not being represented in policymaking and decision-making. And also policymakers have the potential to ensure a more balanced consideration of nature's diverse values. So we did in chapter 2, that's also reflected in SPM, we developed this typology of values that aims to be more inclusive of the diversity of values that exist. And one of the findings, for example, is that amongst Indigenous peoples and local communities, there is no distinction between humans and nature. We are all part of this systems of relationships, and the values that apply to nature as understood by Western science, for example, can also apply to relationships between humans to humans, such as many principles and philosophies that are represented across different groups, from Ubuntu to Buen Vivir to philosophies of good living around the world. So with this typology, we depart from worldviews and knowledge systems, considering the variety and the diversity of worldviews and knowledge systems to be inclusive of these knowledge systems, including different languages. And then also recognizing the existence of broad values such as justice, equity, and reciprocity that are represented. They are general guiding principles, specific values that are tied to specific contexts and species. For example, mountains seen as kinship among the Maori in New Zealand and groups, Indigenous groups in China, or values tied to specific ecosystems and biodiversity. And then value indicators would be these measures. So if you need to conduct a monitoring, and monitoring is important, you will need some measures. But these measures can also be developed by and with Indigenous peoples and local communities, such as, for example, language vitality will be an important indicator, and others, so it's quantitative and qualitative measures that will let us assess values. So this is just a general explanation of this typology. And I will now pass to Tuyeni that will guide us through section B and the valuation processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona, and thank you everyone for this opportunity to present this particular part of the Summary for Policymakers, which comes primarily from chapter 3. And in chapter 3, we look at the different methods, approaches, procedures, practices that are out there, and they're used in trying to elicit and understand these different types of values that Simona just told us about. Next, please. So to begin with, we need, in the same way that the second chapter and the first try to provide a common understanding for what values are. In the assessment, we define valuation as a process, and it's a process that uses different methods, different procedures in order to make values visible, to elicit them and to know that they exist and how much, so even to measure them, and what values are being held or what values are at play in a given situation. And this is extremely important for any kind of decision making. Through a very deep review of more than 1,200 papers, and trying to identify all the different methods and approaches that are mentioned and have been used in different contexts, we identified about 50 methods. So when they're all grouped together and take away all the ones that sort of repeat themselves, more than 50 valuation methods and approaches that are currently available for decision makers to use. And they come from different disciplines and knowledge systems. No single discipline has developed all these methods alone. And that when you start to group these methods, particularly based on the kind of information that they use and where they source their information from, we identified 4 broad methods that four broad families that we call methods families in the assessment. And because they group all these methods that have come from different disciplines, we consider them as discipline neutral classification system. We also found that power relations or power asymmetries are a constant in the process evaluation. They determine which and whose values are recognized, which valuation method is used, and as such, the information that the valuation process generates and how that then percolates to the decision making. So this is a constant thing to manage in an evaluation process. Next slide, please. So as I said, that we identified 4 method families and use this as a framework in the rest of the assessment to identify strengths and weaknesses of valuation process, of the process of evaluation methods. But we also recognize through a process of trying to understand how valuation is undertaken in Indigenous peoples and local communities, we realize that a rigid application of this way of classifying methods is actually unnecessary, and it can risk omitting or misrepresenting the cultural and spiritual beliefs that are integral to the worldviews and ways of living and ways of doing valuation of Indigenous people and local communities. So while some cases, in some of the valuation approaches and procedures and practices that we identified as coming from Indigenous people and local communities, some of them could and do seem similar, like valuations, methods and approaches from other disciplines. But the risk of trying to put everything in boxes in the way we did with these other more Western science methods has its risks. And we recognize that extremely explicitly in the values assessment. Next, please. So we did a call, a very targeted call to about 76 experts in Indigenous and local knowledge from around the world, trying to incorporate different regions, different livelihood types, and asked them to write essays answering specific questions about how valuation is conducted in the communities that they work in. We got 26 responses, which we used then to try to understand Indigenous peoples and local communities' valuation processes. And what was very clear is, of course, they undertake valuation in their own places and territories and in accordance with their own worldviews, and applying them their locally established procedures for doing so, and everyone understands what these are and what is the correct way of doing them. And that something very specific about valuation in these contexts is that it not only considers different types of information, but that information can come from, can include information from ancestors, from non-human species, from landscape and spiritual beings. So it is not contained in the same way to what's here and visible, as is the case, for instance, to methods developed in more Western science approaches. And that as a result, this way of doing valuation, particularly because it was also grounded on principles of reciprocity, of responsibility, can really offer new perspectives to improve and advance valuation processes outside IPLC contexts. Next, please. And in a review of methods beyond those by Indigenous peoples and local communities, it is clear that over time, participatory methods have gained traction, and there's more and more participation of stakeholders in the process of valuation, but it is still at a very basic level, in that sense that potentially affected people participating in the evaluation process are mostly provide data and information rather than get involved in, for instance, interpretation of that data, or even deciding which values should be assessed. So participation is still very low. And that there are three main factors that need to be considered constantly in any evaluation, and that is, we're calling them the 3 R's: relevance, robustness, and resource requirements. And that when deciding what method to use requires balancing across these three factors. Relevance being that the valuation process is meaningful to those who are involved in it, that it generates robust information that's true, that speaks truly of the actual situation and is trustworthy, and that it is being conducted through skills, the resources, that there's a skill to do it and the resources to be able to undertake it. So it's always a constant balance, and that most valuation processes go through a 5-step process that are depicted in this image here, and that at each process, these 3 R's are constantly being traded off and navigated. And this is sort of the main findings that we have from the valuation aspect of the assessment. Thank you. And I think now I pass on to Elena.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, it is an honor to be sharing this experience with so many Indigenous people that have been fighting for their rights. And what we are going to present in the 2 following slides is the product of the work of many authors that are contributing in chapter 4 and chapter 5 mainly. So the next one, please. So how can we assure that policies are more inclusive of how different people live, relate to, and value nature? It is recognizing and respecting the worldviews, the place-based and collective values and traditional knowledge of Indigenous people and local communities, but also of legitimizing their conventions, their norms, and the rules that support their rights, their territories, and their interests. Only if we consider all these place-based and collective values, and I underline here collective, in decision-making can lead to more equitable and sustainable outcomes. So in order to reconfigure new conventions, norms, and rules, we require a process of transformation of existing power structures that can consider all this diversity of nature values in decision-making. And this could be the potential to negotiate conflicts that arise from not identifying and anticipating these value clashes. The following, please. Well, we are finally recognizing there is a global biodiversity crisis, but to address it and to achieve just and sustainable futures, we require a system-wide and fundamental change, a transformative change. And there are multiple pathways to navigate towards a just and sustainable future, but we have to make sure to include those arising from indigenous peoples and local communities' worldviews and knowledge systems, as for example, all the earth stewardship and living well as Buen Vivir or Ubuntu, that underline the relational and intrinsic and instrumental values in that order. So to support this transformative change, indigenous people and local communities have to continue to demand this recognition and respect for diverse values, to continue creating networks to foster peer-to-peer learning, and to continue enabling wider participation in decision-making. For this, we have to construct governance structures that can give voice to and to act upon sustainability-aligned values in the decision-making processes. That we have to include this public deliberation and citizen engagement continuously. Thank you. I'm passing the word to Simone once again.
Thank you so much, Elena. So as Elena was explaining, sustainability-aligned values, including those of indigenous peoples and local communities, can and should guide the design and implementation of transformative policy instruments, initiatives, and cross-sectoral development policies. Here in the values assessment, we recognize the broad values of sustainability and justice as guiding principles. They are also connected with the Sustainable Development Goals and other policies, the post-2030 Global Outlook, Biodiversity Outlook, and other global policies, as well as local policies and instruments. So it's highlighted also in the Sustainable Use Assessment. So these sustainability-aligned values shape people's interactions with nature and with each other as well. And some examples are unity, responsibility, stewardship, and justice. Also that came from the many submissions that we received from indigenous peoples and local communities and the evidence. So we need to develop capacities, not only IPLC capacities, as was highlighted by Marla in the previous presentation, but also very importantly, was highlighted by indigenous peoples and local communities in the dialogue that we had in Mexico. The capacities of various decision makers need to be developed to recognize and address power and equity asymmetries and foster inclusive social learning that involves different types of knowledge and the diversity of values. And also we need, it's very important to then address gaps of information, resources, and capacities that hinder the inclusion of values into decision-making. Those need to be bridged, developed, and bridged. The next, please. And finally, values, we recognize and highlight in the SPN that values held and expressed by indigenous peoples and local communities can inspire different models of social environmental governance. I think it was already mentioned this by Elena and Tuyeni's slides. We want to highlight that collaborative governance and co-design of management plans and policies offer multiple opportunities for inclusion and increased representation of IPLCs in decision-making. But in that, it's very important to address the loss of local indigenous and local languages, knowledge, and values. And these can be tackled to integrated policies toward recognition of both biocultural diversity and territorial rights. In the values assessment, we developed a cross-assessment case study, was focused on philosophies of good living. And that case study recognized that across the world, across the globe, many indigenous peoples and local communities held similar understanding, very diverse, but at the same time, there are some similar guiding principles. And those guiding principles that are rooted in this idea of good living or good quality of life can inspire different modes and models of governance. So these philosophies of good living, we found, are associated with relational values and collective good quality of life between people and people and people and nature. And this have inspired from the Andes, Amazon region and the Andean countries' constitutions to rights of nature movements around the world. However, it's important to recognize that their integration to norms and legal rules should be transparent and inclusive of indigenous peoples and local communities. I think that this was what we had to present. I pass the floor back to Mariana now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone, and also to Elena and to Jenny. So yes, in fact, that's all we have for now. Thank you, and we look forward to your questions and your comments, both live and in the chat. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. We really appreciate you spending this time with us and sharing the important results of the value assessment with us. As Mariana just said, we're looking forward to receiving your questions. You can write in the question and answer function or in the chat. Once again, behind the scenes here, we have Simone Elena Tuyeni, who you all just heard from, and also Gabriel. I see I put his first name twice, Gabriel Ricardo Nemoga, who is here with us as well. He's one of the authors from the assessment. So they can be answering your questions behind the scenes. And then to get us started, we have two members of Indigenous peoples who've offered to share some reflections with us on the values assessment. So first of all, I'd like to pass the floor to Joji Carino from the Philippines. Joji, the floor is yours, please.
Thanks very much, Peter. So I'd just like to share some reflections. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. First of all, I wish to congratulate and actually thank IPBES for the values assessment. It is very timely, and hopefully it is not yet too late for this values assessment to have the same positive impact as its 2019 global assessment on the ongoing negotiations of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Its key messages are extremely important for framing, guiding, and refining the finalization of the 2050 biodiversity goals and targets. I remember that in the early days of IPBES, participants from indigenous peoples and local communities were advocating for focused work on values by IPBES. And in a very recent meeting of IIFB, we were also discussing how values, particularly relational values, could further be strengthened in the latest negotiation text of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. That this should include recognition of indigenous peoples and local communities' diverse value systems, including an important point of people's reciprocal contributions to nature, not just nature's contributions to people. And some of these values were previously invisible or marginalized in past biodiversity strategies, which privilege state-centered planning, market-oriented approaches towards nature, and funding which was largely informed by the conservation community. So my remaining remarks are just to highlight how some of the key messages from the IPBES values assessment which bear repeating because of their significant relevance for informing the post-2020 GBF negotiations. Because these messages are almost speaking directly to some of the challenges faced by Indigenous peoples and local communities when we try to propose changes in the text. So it is clear from the assessment that most policy making have prioritized narrow sets of values of nature, and that the values of Indigenous peoples and local communities have been undervalued and underutilized. So we can definitely cite the evidence in the assessment around this. But clearly, positively, it states that policymakers have the potential to ensure a more balanced consideration of nature's diverse values. And for example, by directly uptaking some of the proposals being made by Indigenous peoples and local communities so that we will have a greater justice and sustainability in the strategy itself. Particularly the issue of governance structures. We know that this is, of course, an intergovernmental-led process, but the adoption of a whole society approach and participatory and equitable governance is something that we have not yet fully won in the negotiations. So that statement that reconfiguring new conventions, norms, and rules under a power structure transformation can motivate the consideration of nature's values in decision-making. I want to highlight that there is the potential to avoid or mitigate conflicts that arise from value clashes. In the current post-2020 negotiations, IIFB has already alerted parties to underlying value clashes which remain unresolved in the current text. For example, we still advocate for applying a human rights-based approach, for broadening spatial planning to encompass customary lands and waters and Indigenous territories, that benefit sharing arising from the use of knowledge in all its forms, including digital sequencing information, and that the importance that should be given to community-based monitoring to complement other monitoring by global bodies, research institutions, and governments in seeing how well we are doing in the post-2020 framework. So finally, I'd just like to call on all of us to grasp the opportunities offered by the IPBES Values Assessment to advance the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. And this can be done by embedding transformative values in the current negotiations, which are being brought forward by IPBES and local communities. So indeed, I strongly commend, just like Ruth, the IPBES values assessment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joji, for sharing those reflections with us from an Indigenous perspective. We really appreciate it. Please do keep writing in the question and answers, and also writing in the chat if you have any questions or comments. We are running very tight for time, as always. Next, so we may not have that much time for any more questions verbally once we finish. So I'm going to pass the floor now to Yesenia Hernandez from Mexico, to give some brief interventions as well from her perspective. Thank you, Yesenia.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much for having me here. I will speak in Spanish. Please turn your translation. Pues esta evaluación reconozco que
this assessment I believe it's important. 34 pages of a summary for policymakers, but we definitely need to go through the whole text, the whole document. When I got the news of the approval, I was pretty excited because I believe the assessment was important for IPLCs, especially. I think the assessment was key, and this is the first time that the international community analyzes these different values, diverse values. I think they found 50, but probably you will identify even more along the time if we keep on reviewing and documenting the existence of more tools. And why is it so important? I think Georgie mentioned it. The challenges that we Indigenous people face, aggressions, criminalization, death, assassination, because we defend nature based on our values. The different conflicts related to environmental issues, I think it is pretty well reflected in the analysis, and it is important for the Framework Convention and the discussions where we are looking at living in harmony with nature, and it provides lots of different inputs on changing to different ways of living, like living in harmony with nature. As I said, there are several things that I wanted to share, but I wrote a note that I will be sharing with you via the chat. But I believe recognizing our different values and different ways of looking at nature just have to be recognized by the others. Why do we probably say we want mountains rather than mine? And some people will believe that we are against development, but that's not the case. We are looking at the wrong run. We are looking at nature preservation and other important things when we share that view. And I think we need to include IPLCs in the different changes. I hope that this document actually change the mindset of policymakers so that we can try to avoid the different environmental conflicts arising when values are not necessarily taken into account or where we have dominant values in place. Lots of communication efforts are required, like this one. You are referring to co-creating information to value, and I would like probably to invite you all to co-value. So to look for those processes of collaborating, to exchange those values, to put the basis to create that transformative change. I would like to remind you that for us, Indigenous people and local communities, living in nature is our way of living, of existence. We heard from many operations changing our livelihoods to go through different ways of living, and we have faced lots of different challenges to accept who you are, to be accepted as who we are. We hope that this document, this report, actually shows that our livelihood, our living could be also shared with us for all of us, for the benefit of all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yesenia, for those reflections and for that call to action as well for everybody, including policymakers and Indigenous peoples and local communities. We're running very short of time. There's been lots of questions coming in on the question and answers that the authors have responded to. There are also a lot of questions that have come in on the chat. And I believe most of those have been addressed by the authors as well. If there's anything that you feel like any additional questions you have, any additional thoughts or anything you don't think that we were able to cover, you can send an email to me after the session, and I'll be happy to either try to respond or to connect you with some of the authors so that you can ask them your questions with more time. I've just put my email address in the chat there. So please do note that email address down, and you can write to us if you wish. And also we will be downloading the chat, and we'll make sure that we go through it and check to see if anything was missed or if we need to follow up on anything. So please do write in the chat as well if you want to, if you want to continue the conversation, and if you feel that we weren't able to get into everything in a satisfactory way. Okay, we just wanted to very quickly go through some next steps with you, and there have been various questions about this as well during the discussions. So laid out versions of the SPMs will be available soon, and those will be available in all 6 UN languages, and they'll be available on the IPBES websites. And as we've been discussing in this session, the aim is that those can really be tools that can be used in discussions between Indigenous peoples and policymakers or other actors. And so these are the products of this whole process available in those 6 UN languages. IPBES will also produce a document really highlighting the messages and also the chapter text of the assessments, which is of particular relevance to IPLCs. In general, all of the assessments are relevant to IPLCs, but we will be trying to pull out those key items and issues so that they're easy for people to find. And we'll also be making that available on the website. And then we also plan to partner with other organizations to create other materials, which could be social media, it could be videos, it could be posters. So if you have any ideas or things that you would like to see as products from these assessments, please do feel free to write to me at that address that I put there. And we're always happy to hear proposals of the kind of products you would want to see, and also who you think we could partner with to do those, because we're always looking for partners who can help us work, for example, in different languages. So that's some homework for you to be thinking about what you would like to see the next steps to be, and just let us know. And with that, it's my pleasure to pass over to Lucy Mulenke, who is also co-chair of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, and she'll be giving us some closing words. So Lucy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much, everyone. Actually, Peter, you've almost summarized everything, and I think I really appreciate the way the whole discussion has gone from the beginning, from the time the opening up to now the end, because it was very inclusive. And just want to be on behalf of my co-chair Ramiro, who opened the discussion, that we are really very thankful and happy that everything is going on well, and that IPBES was ready to share all this information to us. And as you say, there's quite a lot of discussion that has gone on, which is very, very important. And I don't want to repeat a lot that has been already said by Anna Maria from the beginning to all the others, who had participated in different assessments, and especially also in the value assessment, which came towards the end, which was really comprehensive. And as Georgie had already said, this is coming at the right time when we are looking at the different issues, discussing different targets and different issues on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and also related to other work. If you look at the sustainable assessment and the others, is very, very much related to the different activities that we do. And we would like to also ask our Indigenous and local communities to look at this assessment very clearly, to go back again and revise and look at the different areas. And if there are any issues that you would like to further look at them, will be very, very important, because we are the same people who will be helping the policymakers also understand. And we hope our policymakers can also pick up this in the knowledge that they know Indigenous people have participated effectively. So I won't take much of the time. I would just say thank you all very much. And this is something that we, as an International Indigenous Forum, we look forward to continuing working with IPBES, continue doing these assessments together, contribution. As Viviana had already said, there is already a committee, a group that is working on issues of Indigenous knowledge. And we want to make sure that we continue engaging and getting much from both science and our Indigenous traditional knowledge. So thank you all very much. And I want again to thank IPBES for giving us this opportunity to be able to participate, and we'll continue doing that. Thank you all, and I wish everyone a very good and understanding time in looking at the science assessments that we are given, because they always relate to our own Indigenous knowledge. Thank you, and have a good time.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And with that, we're going to close the meeting. So thank you so much, everybody, for participating. We really appreciate it, and your ongoing support and interest is what really makes this process work. So thank you all so much, and take care, and good morning, good afternoon, or good night, depending on where you are. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.